Iran is behind a large number of plots that MI5 has worked to thwart, which include targeted attacks on individuals. They are also behind a lot of the Islamist extremism. They are funding, they are supporting. I would put it as one of the, if not the most pressing domestic security threat that we face in the United Kingdom.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. It can feel like an uphill challenge for Israel to get the world to take seriously the threat posed by Iran and its proxies. But Iran's massive, unprecedented missile and drone attack on April 13th was a game changer. Iran had spent decades in the shadows working to arm and deploy a global network of terrorist militias. On April 13th, it stepped out of the shadows, putting its true murderous intent on display for the world to see. But Iran is still operating in the shadows, not just against Israel, against the West, extending its malign activities far beyond the borders of the Middle East. And my guest today gives us an inside look at how democracies are waking up to the threat. The Right Honourable Suella Braverman was the British Home Secretary when the Iran-sponsored October 7th massacre happened. She joins me on State of a Nation during a special personal solidarity visit to Israel to bear witness to the horrors of 10/7. Together we dive into how the UK's intelligence services are battling Iranian attacks on Britain's own soil, and how the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, are trying to undermine the institutions of the West. We also dive into the problems of the anti-Israel hate parades that have taken over central London on weekends, and we look at the future of the UK-Israel relationship as Suella Braverman accuses the British government of backsliding on its support for Israel. In the wake of those massive attacks on Israel, October 7th, the Iranian missile attack, now is the time for the West to be clear on who its allies are and who its enemies are, to show a united front against the enemies of democracy. For now, there's still time, but should the Iranians be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, the next attack on Israel, the next attack on anywhere else in the region or around the world, could be truly catastrophic. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens with a 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Suella Braverman, welcome to State of a Nation.
Thank you, Eylon.
You're wrapping up a 3-day solidarity visit in Israel. Tell me, what have you been doing? What's it been like?
I'm coming to the end of a very powerful and what feels like a necessary visit to Israel, overall to show my solidarity in person and on the ground to the Israeli people who have gone through some of the worst suffering that we've seen for decades after, on October the 7th, to learn more about the impacts of the massacre and the terrible attacks that you all encountered in October, to see what the response has been, to speak to politicians, and to find out more, importantly for me and for the UK audience, about the situation in the north of Israel, which has been wholly unreported upon, to my mind, in the UK, whereby there are 150,000 Israelis who have been evacuated and displaced from their homes because of the 4,000 rockets that they have been on the receiving end of since October the 7th because of Hezbollah attacks. So it's been a very wide-ranging meeting, and it's been topped off with some meetings with senior political and military figures.
And that's so important to raise the alarm about what is happening in the north, where there are tens of thousands of internally displaced people, because if a war does erupt with Hezbollah after its sustained aggression, it's really important that people understand it isn't coming out of nowhere, that Hezbollah has been shelling Israel repeatedly for months and forced people to leave. You've been following the situation very closely. Is there anything from your personal visit that has surprised you being here on the ground?
Well, I've been incredibly uplifted by the resilience and the determination of the Israeli people. I've met with the parents of people who were murdered in the most brutal circumstances on October the 7th, and they've displayed huge grace, dignity and resilience. I've met the mothers and relatives of hostages who are still in captivity as we speak now under the control of Hamas, and they are determined and hopeful. I've met people, as I said, who've been evacuated, and they are committed and focused on rebuilding their lives and not buckling under the many threats that Israeli people face across all of your borders. So I've been very surprised by that optimism and defiance in the face of evil by the Israeli people. And secondly, the complexity of the situation has really been brought home to me. This is, the threats that Israel faces are complex and multifarious. On the south, you are facing a brutal death cult in the form of Hamas, which is in now control of Gaza, which is thwarting the distribution of aid in Gaza, which is holding hostages captive, which is refusing to lay down arms and end this conflict tomorrow. On the east, you're facing issues relating to instability in relation to Shiite militias and an unstable Jordan because of Iranian influence. And in the north, Syria and Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah and other Islamist-inspired terror groups are mobilizing to a heavy degree and a high scale to attack Israel at the first opportune moment. So, and behind it all sits their masters, the Ayatollahs in Iran, and understanding the form in which this threat takes has been very useful for me. And it's also emphasised the enormity of the problem, that this is not just a simple conflict between Arabs and Israelis, between Palestine and Israel. This is about a battle between right and wrong. This is a battle between barbarity and Western civilization. And Israel represents all that is good about Western civilization: democracy, the rule of law, protection of human rights. And Hamas and these Islamist groups represent all that is nefarious and damaging and dangerous for the West. And if we don't stand by Israel in this conflict, the rest of Western civilization will face and will continue to face irresistible and incredibly serious threats.
Its geopolitical dimension is, of course, critical, but it sounds like for you this solidarity visit has a personal dimension as well. It's been 6 months since the massacre, and we haven't exactly been seeing a huge number of solidarity visits likely from politicians.
You're right. On October the 7th, I was the Home Secretary in the United Kingdom, and in the UK, not just members of the government, but everyone, it felt like in Britain, was shocked and horrified by what we were watching on our television screens and what was happening in Israel to Israelis. And what we've seen in the UK afterwards is, unfortunately, instead of growing and solidified support, we are now seeing 6 months on a weakening of support, as I see it, and unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in the UK. And for me, that's a grave shame for Britain in the 21st century, when members of the Jewish community feel that they can't go into London on a Saturday because of pro-Palestinian hate marches, where there's been unparalleled levels of harassment, intimidation, racism in our universities, on our streets, in our workplaces. And to my mind, the authorities have turned a blind eye to this. And as a result, members of the Jewish community are feeling very, very uncomfortable in the UK right now. And I feel for them, and I want to tell them that Jewish people in the UK, Jewish people here in Israel have friends around the world, and we are your allies, and we will stand by you in your hour of need.
That's important, and I want to delve into with you to understand what has been going on the streets of London. It's left many Israelis horrified. Understand what has been happening with British policy towards this war. But first, to set the scene, when the October 7th massacre happened, you were Britain's Home Secretary. You are now not Britain's Home Secretary. What happened?
When the attack happened on October the 7th, as I said, the UK government was horrified and stood with Israel. What we saw, I think, only a few days after October the 7th, importantly before Israel had gone into Gaza and took any military defensive measures, there were thousands of people taking to the streets of Britain in protest against Israel and in support of Hamas in many aspects. We saw regular marches take place, as I say, even before any military action by Israel. And on some of those early marches, we saw flagrant anti-Semitism, to my mind. We saw routine and heartfelt chanting of anti-Semitic phrases like "from the river to the sea." It's a call to eliminate the state of Israel and, by implication, the Jewish people. We saw groups of people chanting jihad at the tops of their voices. And throughout those first few weeks of the marches and then going into October, the police, particularly the Met Police, were responsible for policing those marches and ensuring and enabling public order. As Home Secretary, my responsibility was not to direct the police on their operational decisions. No minister has that power because they are operationally independent. But it was my job to ensure that people maintained confidence in the police in terms of the way they were approaching these marches, and that ultimately the right balance was being struck and people felt that they had the right to protest. I support the legitimate right to peaceful protest. It's a foundational element of a functioning democracy. But also, at the same time, that disorder was not on our streets, that it didn't cross the line into intimidation, harassment, racism, incitement to hatred, glorification of terrorism, all of which would constitute criminal activity. I grew increasingly frustrated over the course of October, over the course of these marches, getting bigger, getting more aggressive, getting more anti-Semitic. And I became very vocal in my concern. I should say over this period of time, many members of the British public, members of the government and the Jewish community were feeling increasing levels of concern. And it all came to a head in the run-up to Armistice Day. Armistice Day is a day of great significance in Britain. It symbolises the sacrifice of the brave men and women who gave their lives for their country in war. And it's celebrated around the country. It is a day of solemn reflection, and there's often a parade in Whitehall, and there's moments that there are events around the country to commemorate Armistice Day. And on that day, a pro-Palestinian hate march, as I called them, was planned. In the run-up to Armistice Day, I believe that march should not have gone ahead. The clash of those two events was unacceptable, and I believed that out of respect for our war heroes, a pro-Palestinian march, which would have had hundreds of thousands of people, potentially, anti-Semitism on our streets, racist behaviour, a risk of provoking a counter-protest, potentially, from the far right, which would be unacceptable, all made it too much of a threat to public order and public safety. I don't have the power. I didn't have the power in law to ban that march, or any march, indeed. And it was up to the Met Commissioner, the chief of the police, to assess the circumstances of that particular march on that particular day and request a ban from me. And there was a lot of tension about whether the Met Commissioner would consider this march inappropriate on Armistice Day, and whether he would request a ban formally from me. He didn't, in the end, and the march went ahead. over Armistice weekend. There was disruption, there was disorder, a counter-protest did take place, and I think there were very ugly scenes on the streets of Britain when this march was going on.
And how did that lead to your no longer being Home Secretary?
I voiced my disappointment in how the police had failed to properly ensure public order.
In a column in the Times, was it not?
And I wrote a column in the Times setting out that frustration. I didn't cross any boundary when it came to operational independence, but I did feel it was incumbent on me to speak truthfully on behalf of the British people, on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of fair-minded observers, that there had been a shortfall in the situation and that there was a double standard and two-tier policing, that those who were protesting against the Jewish state, calling Israel a genocide state, calling Israel an apartheid state, that they were somehow, that they were receiving, the police were turning a blind eye to the racism and the harassment that they were responsible for. But in many other instances, a far more robust approach by the police would be taken. For example, several years ago, we had women protesting against the murder of a young woman in London, Sara Everard, and they were very quickly arrested for standing up for women's rights and justice. And I felt that there was an inconsistency, a double standard, and I said as much.
It must be very disturbing as Home Secretary to see how a foreign policy issue far away across the sea is suddenly importing threats of violence and intimidation onto the streets of Britain. And I'm wondering, to what extent is British policy towards this war, towards Israel, being driven by fears of disorder or what is unfolding on Britain's streets? To what extent are those protests driving Britain's foreign policy in turn?
I think that that's a really good question. And I think that there must be some connection between the outpouring of anti-Israel sentiment that we've seen on the streets of Britain over the last 6 months, what I call the phenomenon of mass extremism on the streets of Britain, something that's really shocked me and saddened me. And what I also perceive right now as a weakening in British support for Israel, something which concerns me profoundly.
And do you think that's being driven because of pressure from the streets?
Not directly, but I think what we see on the streets is a symptom of a prevailing view in the UK, in our institutions. So whether it's the police and their soft approach to pro-Palestinian hateful marches, or whether it's on campus and the failure of vice-chancellors to discipline anti-Semitic behaviour by academics or students towards Jewish students, or whether it's local authorities, failing to, clean up anti-Semitic graffiti on their walls. It can go from the quite micro to the macro in terms of how 300,000 people are managed on a march, or whether it's judges who are responsible for, who should be paragons of impartiality, behaving in a way that shows that they are partisan in this particular issue. I could go on. There's a long list of examples in Britain where we see that there is a narrative which has taken hold that, to simplify it, Israel is bad and anybody else is good. And I think that institutional view is connected to some of the decisions relating to our foreign policy.
After you were sidelined as Home Secretary, the Prime Minister took a slightly different tack on the question of domestic extremism. First of all, announcing new powers for the police and also making this statement, standing on the step of Downing Street, making a speech warning about the shocking rise in extremist disruption, taking a swipe at Islamists and other anti-Israel demonstrators, as well as the far right. Let's take a listen to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak here.
What started as protests on our street has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence. Since October the 7th, there have been those trying to take advantage of the very human angst that we all feel about the terrible suffering that war brings to the innocent, to women and children, to advance a divisive, hateful ideological agenda. On too many occasions recently, Our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions.
Watching that, no longer in government but from the backbenches, what's your take? Is Britain doing enough to counter this domestic extremism threat? Do you feel vindicated, perhaps, that something you sounded the alarm early on, the government has taken a more proactive stance?
Well, that speech that the Prime Minister made, I think was in March, so some 4 or 5 months after October the 7th, 4 or 5 months after these regular marches. And I think even a few days after this speech, there was another hate march that took place. I think the words were admirable, and I agree with a lot of what the Prime Minister said on the steps of Downing Street. Unfortunately, the time for words is over because anti-Semitism has reached unprecedented levels in the UK. Extremism and Islamism, I feel, has pervaded many aspects of British life, and words are insufficient. We need robust preventative action and enforcement to actually stop this. Well, we need tougher laws when it comes to public protest. You know, I proposed as Home Secretary, and I continue to argue in favour of a law that enables the Home Secretary to ban a march in special and exceptional circumstances, for example, like on Armistice Day. Not a total ban, because people are entitled to the legitimate right to peaceful protest, but a power for ministers to ban particular marches. I think it's important for greater powers when it comes to public order, so that there's a much more peaceful element to demonstrations.
The critics would say that the response to what you perceive as a threat to democracy is not another threat to democracy in the form of shutting down expression and marches and protest.
I would disagree with that. I think that everybody has a right to express opposition to a question of foreign policy. And I accept that this is the Middle Eastern politics is polarising. There are strong views on all sides of the argument, but that doesn't and cannot be used as an excuse for anti-Semitism. And what we've seen is anti-Semitism really evolve into operate under the guise of anti-Israel sentiment, and people use the Trojan horse of social justice and left-wing politics as a vehicle to actually express what is old-fashioned Jew hatred.
The Jewish community in the UK is feeling very lonely and isolated at the moment, feeling it doesn't have many friends willing to stand up to the mobs together with them. And I was actually very moved to see that you attended the rally in Trafalgar Square to mark 100 days since the massacre. I saw you were there when I got off the stage. I was speaking there, and I was very moved that you were in the audience. But also in the audience, I saw a sea of Iranian dissident flags, almost as many as there were Israeli flags. And I'm wondering, someone from an ethnic minority background yourself, what communities you identify within the UK as natural allies of the Jewish community in standing up to what is, let's admit, in a numbers game, a far larger Arab and Muslim community that is very forcefully taking the Palestinian side, and some very disturbing expressions of anti-Semitism. Who are the Jewish community's friends in the UK?
I think that you're right to point out dissident Iranians and moderate Muslims, and I think that they are obvious allies to the Jewish community, and I applaud a lot of work, interfaith work between the Muslim and Jewish communities in that regard. But let's be clear, this Islamist threat is a threat to the Jewish community. It's a threat to British values. It's a threat to moderate Muslims. And I saw this as Home Secretary, that dissident Iranians, for example, journalists working for Iran International, a Persian language dissident media outlet based in London, came under huge threat. and were forced to shut down their operation.
Was based in London until it had to relocate to Washington, D.C. And we're recording this just a few days after a horrific attack in London where one of the journalists reporting for Iran International was stabbed multiple times outside his home by a group of men. Police say they're keeping an open mind about the motives, but it has only been a few months since the channel was forced to shut down its London operations. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary, a news outlet being forced to relocate out of the British capital because of violent threats from an enemy regime. To what extent was that on your radar as Home Secretary? Tell me a little bit about the nefarious impact that Iran is having on the domestic extremism threat in the UK.
Well, Iran is behind a large number of plots that MI5 has worked to thwart, late-stage plots, which include targeted attacks on individuals. And they are also behind a lot of the Islamist extremism. They are funding, they are supporting groups and organisations in the UK which are extremist. So we know in those two respects, the Iranian regime in the form of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is working and is very active. I would put it as one of the, if not the most pressing domestic security threat that we face in the United Kingdom. And it concerned me a lot as Home Secretary. And that's why for a very long time I've urged for the prescription of the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. That would give our authorities greater tools to be able to enforce against some of this activity. And the way the IRGC operates in the UK, and from what we know, is that they don't necessarily act directly. They use proxies and they use thugs, they use criminal gangs, they use serious criminals to do their criminal activity. Now, this attack on the individual, horrific attack that we saw last week, there's no confirmation of the facts or the attribution of that attack. But looking at the facts that we know in the public domain, it certainly has all the hallmarks of an IRGC-inspired attack.
What can you share about these late-stage threats you say that MI5 thwarted by Iran against individuals in the UK? Whom has Iran been targeting in the UK?
There's a long list of individuals who have been targeted by the IRGC. People who speak out against the autocratic ayatollahs in Iran, people who are professionals in the media, in journalism, in other fields, who are dissident Iranians.
Are we talking just about dissident Iranians or non-Iranian British citizens as well?
Non-Iranian British citizens as well. So there's a wide range of people who are being targeted explicitly or specifically by the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime, the Iranian vision is to take over the Middle East. And that's why it's developing a nuclear bomb so energetically in defiance of international regulators and the JCPOA. That's why it invests billions of dollars in arming and resourcing Shiite militia groups which surround Israel, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Jihad. And that's why it also has its tentacles as far as UK soil in the form of proxy gangs who are working at their behest to shut down legitimate and free and frank challenge to what they're doing.
Do you think that the Iranian regime feels free to act with impunity on British soil?
I'm afraid I think it does, because the UK authorities have not adopted a sufficiently robust stance or posture towards them. As I said, they're not prescribed. If they were prescribed as an expressly a terrorist organisation according to our laws, that would provide our police, our counter-terrorism policing arm with more powers to arrest people for clearer breaches of the law.
Why do you think that is then, that the UK is not taking a tough enough stance against a foreign regime trying to use violence and murder on the streets of your cities?
I think there's a lack of awareness of the threat that the Iranian regime poses to domestic interests, and the Iranians have disguised a lot of their criminal behaviour in the UK. So, the impression I got and get often is that, again, our institutions are not sufficiently alive to the threat that's posed by Iran.
Do you think it's a question of denial of the extent of the Iranian threat, or actually fear about the consequences of standing up to this violent regime?
A combination. So I think that there is a delusion about the extent of the threat that the Iranians pose, and a tendency to bury one's head in the sand and pretend it's not there. And secondly, I think that there is a fear of retaliation or backlash from the Iranians. That's not how we deal with bullies. That's not how we deal with the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. We need to deal with these organisations with strength, with robustness, and with clarity. And we need more of that right now from the UK.
Using criminal gangs to attack individuals on British soil is, of course, horrific. But can you speak to the wider role that Iran is playing in fanning radicalism and extremism within British society?
Yes. Again, we have evidence that there is funding, resources and other kinds of support flowing from the IRGC towards known Islamist extremist groups in the UK. And the Islamic Centre for England has been one centre that has been discussed and looked into in the past. But there are many other extremist groups in the UK, I'm afraid, which are beneficiaries of Iranian money.
And this is perhaps one of the dynamics that people don't realise about the situation. Here in Israel, of course, we're contending with Hamas, which is a Sunni Islamist group backed by the Shiite regime in Iran. And this union of forces between the Shiite regime in Iran and Muslim Brotherhood forces is something that extends across Europe as well. I mean, they might in the past have been bitter foes, but here, at least in the fight against Israel and the West, they're allies. That point doesn't seem to have clicked in people's minds.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that is a dangerous development, that we are seeing Sunni groups and the Shiite militias and the Shiite Iranian regime unite against other targets. That's only going to strengthen their capabilities, but it reinforces the need for unwavering and rock-solid defensive measures and a zero-tolerance approach to their kind of activity, whether it's on UK soil or whether it's abroad. Because what we're seeing here in Israel, if we don't defeat it, we'll be next.
So let's move from what's been happening in the UK to what's been happening here in Israel, and how you see that affecting British interests. When this war started, with the horrific attacks on October 7th, we were knocked sideways by Britain's support for Israel. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak came here, stood next to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and made, I think, an unprecedented statement that Britain wants Israel to win this war. Not to end in a stalemate, not to end in a ceasefire that leaves Hamas standing. Britain wants Israel to win this war. Let's take a listen to the Prime Minister's remarks, speaking next to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just 2 weeks after the October 7th attacks.
I want to share the deep condolences of the British people and stress that we absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law, to go after Hamas, to take back hostages, deter further incursions, and to strengthen your security for the long term. Now, I know that you are taking every precaution to avoid harming civilians, in direct contrast to the terrorists of Hamas, which seek to put civilians in harm's way. Well, then it's for me to say I'm proud to stand here with you in Israel's darkest hour. As your friend, we will stand with you in solidarity, we will stand with your people, and we also want you to win.
Take me back to the moment the British government understands what is unfolding here in Israel on October 7th, that it's not just another Hamas attack. Take me into what happened in Whitehall that led to this unprecedented statement that Britain wants Israel to win this war.
In the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, ministers were shocked and horrified by what they saw play out. A totally unprovoked, brutal massacre carried out by Hamas terrorists on innocent civilians. The level of violence was on a scale unseen before in the kibbutz. And I visited during my visit my visit the Nova Festival site. I met survivors of that massacre there. I visited the kibbutz Kfar Aza. Again, I met parents, grieving parents, who told me the shocking stories of how their children were murdered. I met a father whose son had been beheaded at the kibbutz, and his head has still not been found.
His head was, they tried to sell it for a ransom.
You know,
they tried to sell it, they tried to sell the head.
This kind of, you know, there's no words. There are no words to reflect the pain and the anguish that innocent people went through. And there's such a long list, unfortunately. And so the UK government was shocked and saw the wrong. And as an ally of Israel, we have a good diplomatic, military, trading relationship, which has been built up over the years. I think there was no question about which side the UK government was going to take. No
question which side it's on, but these rounds of conflict with Hamas have always ended with very swift calls for a ceasefire that would leave Hamas on its feet. And it seems that this time there was something different. So I'm trying to understand, where did Britain think this war was going to go? How did Britain expect this war to develop in pursuit of Israel's goals of destroying Hamas and bringing back the hostages that Britain is saying, we're not in favour of a ceasefire, we want you to win this war? How does Britain expect this to unfold in the immediate days after the war started?
Well, I think everyone in Britain has been surprised by the duration. I think that people in Britain thought in October that this would be resolved, or in as much as you can resolve it, or but at least the military aspect of it would finish in weeks. I think that for my part, you know, having met senior military, senior IDF over the last few years, I'm convinced, or at least very, very confident, that Israel will win this war. If you look at what Israel has achieved so far, it is remarkable in many ways. There has been, to a large extent, you know, an overwhelming destabilization of Hamas and a degrading of their military capabilities, whether it's the successful attacks by the Israelis on their munitions and their weaponry on the Gaza Strip, whether it's the destabilization of 18 out of 24 of their battalions. And, you know, there's been, you know, a very sophisticated approach taken by the Israeli military to minimize civilian casualties. A lot of technology has been used to notify people, give people weeks worth of warning that they should evacuate. And, you know, the movement of over 1 million people on this strip has been a very, very extensive mission, which, you know, has meant that, of course, there is tragic loss of civilian life. Unfortunately, that's an inevitable element of all military combat. But I think in relative terms, it's been low compared to other conflicts that we've seen around the world.
Are you telling me that when Britain makes this extraordinary statement that it wants Israel to win this war, despite its own experience with the Battle of Mosul, knowing how long it took to dislodge ISIS from that city in Iraq, Britain makes this statement because it expects Israel to knock out Hamas much more quickly? It isn't expecting this war to become the political headache that it's become?
I can't speak for the Prime Minister, but I do think people have been surprised by the length of time. But I don't think, I really don't question the initial statements of support from the UK government. I think that they were sincere. They were the obvious right thing to do, to support Israel in her self-defence, in her lawful self-defence of her own interests. And so I wholeheartedly supported the government in its posture towards Israel.
Does Britain still want Israel to win this war?
Well, it's important to ask that question because I am concerned about a softening in the British support for Israel, which I have seen in the last few weeks. For example, I was disappointed about the UK's support for the UN Security Council resolution last week, which stated a call for a ceasefire but did not make a sufficient connection with the release of the hostages. To my mind, a durable ceasefire is only possible if the hostages are released and if the safety and security of Israel is guaranteed. I was also concerned about a shift in language from our Foreign Secretary about recognition of a Palestinian state, going beyond what our general policy has been for years, which is supporting a two-state solution. There's no way in which we should be talking about a unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state before Hamas has laid down their arms, before we can guarantee, as I say, Israel's security. That would be to reward terrorism. That would be to incentivize malicious attacks of the form we saw on October the 7th. So those two instances in particular have made me stop and pause for thought as to whether UK support is still as rock solid as it was in the aftermath immediately of October the 7th.
Because I'll tell you why I'm asking. As a government spokesman during this war, I was making the case that we have a right to win this war and our allies are still behind us. And it felt that with the policy statements, foreign governments are very much on board with Israel's goals of winning this war, to the extent that Lord Cameron, your foreign secretary, speaks of the need for a sustainable ceasefire, but he said this in response to one of the UN votes: a sustainable ceasefire must mean that Hamas is no longer there, able to threaten Israel with rocket attacks and other forms of terrorism. In a joint column he wrote with the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, he also said, you cannot simply call for a permanent ceasefire and hope that it holds. It doesn't deal with the Hamas rocket threat. He said, Hamas leaders have to get out somehow. Hamas has to be dismantled. And of course, those are Israel's war aims. But we find ourselves in a position where our allies still agree that for their national security interests, Israel must destroy Hamas, but can't quite, at least in the language, say what they were saying in the first days of the war, that Israel must win this war. So I want to get your sense on why you think that is, that many of our allies still believe Israel must bring back the hostages, destroy Hamas, make sure Gaza can never pose a threat, but they couch it in language of sustainable ceasefire instead of Israeli victory.
It's a very interesting question. What I have observed is an anti-Israel sentiment within Whitehall. I've been very concerned about a real reluctance within our diplomatic corps, within our civil service, particularly at the Foreign Office, which automatically takes a critical view of Israel and steps that Israel may take to defend herself or military action, and a sympathetic and benevolent view of what Hamas may put out in their press releases, what Hamas may claim, and what Hamas reports is happening on the Gaza Strip. To me, that's a double standard, and that's it's an unfair way of looking at the problem. I also find that the Foreign Office falsely wrongly applies an equivalence between Israeli defensive measures and what Hamas did on October the 7th. The two cannot be compared in any sense whatsoever. So I've detected that in the Foreign Office in the past, and I attribute that to the softening in the position now.
At the 6-month mark since the October 7th massacre, what do you think Britain's national security and foreign policy interest is now in how this war progresses and how it ultimately ends?
Well, what it should be is to maintain our diplomatic, military and political support for Israel, both in continuing to supply Israel with arms, continuing to support Israel at the UN level and amongst allies. It's to ensure that we work with Israel against the Palestinian Authority and what it's doing with regards to the ICC and the ICJ, undermining global institutions and using them against Israel's interests. And we must ensure as well that the Iranian threat is dealt with head on. There are domestic implications for the UK posed by the IRGC, which we are not sufficiently dealing with. And by working closely with Israel, we can increase our chances of defeating the threat posed by Iran, but also bolster security in the region.
You have a very clear view of the common threat that we face in the UK and Israel from Islamist extremists, from Iran, the view that this is a battle against wider Iranian regional hegemony and not only a tit-for-tat between Israelis and Palestinians. 6 months into the war, it is becoming increasingly difficult for us to maintain diplomatic support. Even in the UK, in the wake of the tragic killing of the World Central Kitchen aid workers, including 3 British nationals, we're seeing increasing calls to actually cut off arms supplies to Israel. And I'm wondering what points you think Israel needs to be making in order to reinforce our allies and remind them of the shared interests that we have and hold their hand so that they can continue giving us the support that we need in this war and that is ultimately, in your analysis, a core British interest. How can we help our allies help us?
I think that reminding allies that this is an existential threat, not just for Israel, but for Western civilization, and that when Hamas declares in its charter that its raison d'etre is to destroy Israel, it means it.
Is that a message that cuts through, that this is a threat to Western civilization? Does that sort of language really cut through with the British public?
It's not part of our narrative. I don't think, I would say mainstream British opinion thinks that this is a conflict far away, which doesn't affect the British people directly. I completely disagree with that for the reasons I've set out earlier, but fundamentally because the Iranian aggression towards Israel is an attack on democracy, on human rights, on the rule of law, on protection of minorities, protection and equal rights for women and LGBT groups. That's what Israel represents, those Western values. If these Iranian regimes and Islamist groups win, we have lost a beacon of democracy in the region. And if they win, they will continue to attack further Western values in the UK, in Europe, and in the US.
As they are already, and we see the marches in London chanting Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around, expressing solidarity with the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels who have been attacking British targets in the Red Sea. And I'm wondering, are people making that connection that this is not just an Israeli-Palestinian issue? This is a broader question where on the one side you have Israel and Britain, and on the other side you have Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran.
People are not seeing it in that existential way with, exactly as you say, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iran, I would add China and Russia on that side, and Israel, the UK, US, and the West on the other. Extremism versus civilization, barbarity versus humanity. People are not seeing it along those lines, but that is exactly what we're dealing with here. So this is a broader battle for our values. The second thing I think is about aid to Gaza. Now, I've seen with my own eyes how hard the Israelis are working to increase and ensure the delivery, receipt and distribution of food, water and medicines to the Gaza Strip. And I've seen that they are doing everything within their power to ensure that innocent civilians are getting what they need during this difficult conflict. And I think ensuring that Western allies know that, at countering the misinformation from Hamas on whether it's on the number of casualties, which is totally inflated by Hamas for their own obvious purposes, or whether it's discrediting the UN agencies who have been complicit in the October 7th attacks, or whether it's making clear that Hamas are responsible for obstructing the distribution of aid within the Gaza Strip. People in Britain don't see Gaza through that prism. They see it. They lay the blame at Israel's feet exclusively, and that is not true. So there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and there's a real battle of words that the Israelis need to engage in.
Suella Braverman, former British Home Secretary, thank you very much for coming on State of a Nation, and thank you for coming to Israel on this solidarity visit.
Thank you, Eylon.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And we'll be back soon with more episodes. I'm Eylon Levy, and thank you for joining us.